I am definitely not an expert on communism, but I am interested in what the art of various kinds of societies tell us about those societies. I think really what people build and what they pay for in terms of art is often more revealing about their society than what they say and write about it. So what I wanted to talk about today was the kind of art that is produced under communism, and try to talk a little bit about its origins. And if I could have the first slide, please. But I should say first that I think the best way to educate people about communism is to actually educate them about it. I think there should, my particular interest is teaching American history. I think there should be a part of every American history course, a part of every world history course, a part of every English course that instructs people about the nature of totalitarian and communist regimes. I think our students think that democracy is the natural state of affairs. And I think it's the duty of educators to tell them that this is not the only way the world works. So this memorial, I think, is an important reminder of that. But I think that as I say, the history of communism, the history of Nazism, the history of totalitarianism should be in every classroom. So can I have the next slide, please? I want to talk about a little bit about the birth of a state totalitarian art in the 20th century, and talk a little bit about the art of fascism and the art of Nazi Germany, and then tie that in with communist propaganda in Russia and China and a couple of other places. It's very interesting because in early fascism, there was not an opposition to avant-garde art. One of the characteristics of totalitarian art is that there is a very rigid opposition to new trends in art. But Mussolini, especially, had all sorts of ties with Futurism, which was really one of the most advanced avant-garde movements of the early 20th century. And this is a very futuristic painting of Mussolini surrounded by aeroplanes, very fractured, very different from traditional painting. The next slide, please. The fascist regime in Italy also had many ties and was influenced by the Bauhaus. Now, the Bauhaus was a kind of idealistic movement that started in Germany in the late teens, 20s, and 30s, and developed the international style. And here I show you a dormitory built by the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus really is a kind of collective group of architects. And this was a style very much adopted by totalitarian regimes because it was completely modern. It had no reference to the past. You see there's no ornament. It was what was called a machine for living. It was egalitarian. Everyone had the same kinds of rooms. Every building looked the same. And this kind of architecture was very attractive to a regime that really wanted to control the way people lived and thought. And here I show you another one. This is an Italian version. This is the House of the Fascists in Como, Italy, which is the same kind of situation with shorn of decoration, all right angles, all concrete, and an architecture that became very pervasive in not only in the fascist world, but also in the United States in the 40s and 50s. Here's what it looked like during Mussolini's time. Very different. It was a place where great town events could happen. This is in Como, Italy, space for Mussolini's smiling face, and draped with fascist and Nazi banners. But this changed, and the really authoritarian, totalitarian total permanence and control of the state can be seen, next slide please, in something like this. This is the authoritarian Mussolini, all within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Obey, believe, fight. That was Mussolini's credo. And this was an art that was all pervasive not only in Italy, but it also has its echoes, next slide please, right here in Washington. This is the Watergate by Luigi Moretti, who was one of Mussolini's favorite architects, served a jail term after the war, and then got some plum contracts in the United States, including the Watergate. So let's then turn to Germany. And next slide, please. Again, the strong man, the leader, the triumph of the will. And what both of these regimes developed was a very effective propaganda mechanism, not only in the complete control of propaganda and art policy in the state, but also in very effective propaganda posters and art. And again in Germany, next slide please, there was a revulsion on the part of the Nazi regimes, and especially in Goebbels' art policy, against the art of the past, especially against the art of the early 20th century, the Weimar Republic and the like. And we can see this here. This is the very famous exhibition of decadent art, which was held in Munich and 11 other German cities, where art that was considered impure, un-German, Jewish, was gathered together and exhibited and seen by over 1 million people. Again, this anti-avant-garde art, the purification of art, the use of art for propaganda purposes, which was a big part of the Nazi propaganda effort. Can I have the next? The parallel to this decadent art show was the Great German Art Exhibition of 1937. And this was the showcase for the official Nazi art under the Goebbels agency which dealt with this. And there you can see Hitler visiting this exhibition, and the art that was produced, the art that was official art by the Nazis, was a kind of watered-down neoclassical art. But on the other hand, the Nazi leadership was very interested in Old Master art because they stole it with both hands. Not Hitler, but Goering and the others who looted museums and private collections. There's a little dichotomy there. And so what does this art look like? Next slide, please. This is the four elements. This was owned by Hitler. This was in Hitler's own private collection by his favorite artist, Alfred Ziegler. He also had a famous, a personal architect who we'll talk about in a minute. This was the ideal German woman. This verges slightly on the pornographic. Ziegler was called the master of the pubic hair in Germany. And then his favorite architect was, of course, Alfred Speer. Next slide, please. Who also embodied elements of totalitarian style, which you see in Germany and in Italy, and of course in the Soviet Union. And this was Germania, the great people's hall of Germania. Berlin was to be called Germania. It was to be the center of the Reich, not only the center of the Reich, but the center of the world. And this was a gigantic dome. In it, it could hold the Dome of St. Peter's and the Pantheon. And this, it was, like so much of fascist architecture, meant to overawe, to humble, to subordinate And so, as I say, look at what people build. Look at what is left. Germania was never built. This is the model that Speer did for Hitler, which Hitler poured over. Next slide, please. Now, many of the elements that I've been showing you in fascist art are the art of, these elements are also found in communism. Next, please. As you can see here. Again, the strongman, very effective use of art in these posters. You see Lenin from below. He towers over the spectators. It says, this says, all to the defense of Leningrad. This is a Second World War poster, but again, the image of Lenin was all pervasive. The strong man, the father, but again, very effectively done. But I think you can see in this, there are ties. And so there is this kind of connection between these two state totalitarian regimes. Can I have the next, please? And this is Stalin, helmsman of the state. Now, not much of this really comes into art history. You can look at all sorts of art history texts, and you find almost no mention of communism or communist art, no mention of the art of Nazism or of Italian fascism. What you do see are the kind of more progressive early elements. So students studying the history of art are never exposed to any of this, nor are they exposed to the art of any other dictatorial or proletarian regime. Just as I said in the beginning, nor are they exposed to this in their art history, in their history or world history classes. And of course, in those classes, the opinion of the textbooks and of their teachers is not always necessarily completely negative on communism. So I think that study of art is important because it shows you graphically what the aims and philosophies of these regimes were. So the next slide. And that can be seen, of course, in this huge memorial, which was put up in Budapest, dedicated in 1949, the Iconography of Stalin. It was built to celebrate Stalin's 70th birthday. A journalist at the time wrote, "Stalin was with us earlier, now he will be with us evermore. He will watch over our work, and his smile will show us the way." Communist paternalism writ large. Of course, these statues, as we know, of Lenin and of Stalin and of Mussolini at the end of the Second World War, were symbols that were attacked. Next slide, please. And here you see this statue in 1956 in the Hungarian Revolution. These also became hated symbols by those repressed by these regimes. They were potent, very potent symbols of communist domination. Like fascist, like Nazi Germany, the official art, next slide please, of Russia was pretty much PAP. I call it the tractor by moonlight school of art. And here you can see a good example of that. These content peasants, free from any repression, are eating the tractor in the background, the fertile fields, optimistic glorification of the peasants and their means of production. And this is a typical example of what we could call Soviet socialist realism. And this kind of realism we see not only in Russia and the Soviet Union, but elsewhere, as I will show you right now. Next slide, please. And we can see this kind of art in communist China. center around the glorious figure of the benevolent Mao. This could be called, international socialist realism. And again, this is an institution of the official style, like it was in Italy, like it was in Germany, and like it was in Russia. But of course, in the Soviet Union to some extent, but certainly in China, the Cultural Revolution was responsible for the destruction of art, untold destruction of the cultural patronage of China. Both countries destroyed or sold what they deemed anti-regime, and this is really one of the great acts of barbarism in the whole history of art. You see the same faceless followers, the same giganticism in Mao. This again is the paternalistic Mao with happy miners. In this style, very realistic, academic style, proletarian realism, the benevolent leader, and the bright future of the Cultural Revolution. And of course, this was not just in painting, it was in poetry, it was in opera, it was in film, it was all pervasive official style. But it spread beyond this and still exists in a couple of places. Next slide, please. North Korea. This is a really good example of this. Kim Jong-il with his father, Kim Il-sung. I guess that might be a very slender missile in his hand. World domination, the globe turned just the right way. I mean, it's hard for us to take this seriously, and that's another reason that art historians don't study this as much, because so much of the art produced under this regime is banal, but nonetheless important for the understanding of the aims of these regimes. And I was very fascinated to hear this discussion of Cuba in the earlier panel. Next slide, please, because I have a little section on Cuba here. The same kind of social realism art here, Fidel entering Havana in 1959, the strongman, the faceless followers. But of course, the most famous symbol of the Cuban Revolution, Che, worn by wealthy college students and anarchists worldwide, the idol of the revolution, here probably the most potent symbol of the Cuban communist regime, and which can be very adroitly manipulated. Next slide, please. For political purposes, with still this powerful propaganda punch. And I'll just end with one more. Vietnam, another communist regime, and show you again the manipulation of this symbolism with Mao in the background. So I think, as I said, what people build, what they pay for, what they suppress, tells us a great deal about the societies in which they live and their philosophical and ideological aims. And that's why I think it's very important not only to talk about totalitarian communist philosophy, but also to see what they actually paid for, to see how their ideas, their ideals are expressed in visual images. And that's why I think it's important for students not only study the history of communism, but to have some acquaintance with the history of the art of those regimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Next is Dr. Harrison.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to speak with you all. So I'm going to beg to differ that students and teachers aren't educated about communism. since I personally have been teaching about communism and the Cold War and the Soviet Union and East Germany for over 20 years, and I have many colleagues around the country at various universities who are also teaching courses on the Cold War and the Soviet Union and communism. So certainly there could be more teaching, but it is there. And there are some fantastic books, some fantastic resources, some fantastic websites with documents that sort of expose what communist regimes in the Soviet bloc were like. At GW, we were lucky enough to get a couple of NEH grants to train high school teachers in teaching on the Cold War. And you can't teach on the Cold War without teaching on communism and the global conflict between the US and the Soviet Union. So I have been teaching Americans, but also students from all over the world who come to GW, but I've also lectured in many countries around the world on this. So I think there are syllabi out there from teachers teaching on various aspects of communism and the Cold War. Their AP World History, my goddaughter who just, took her AP World History exam, there was some question about the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the US and the Soviet Union. So I was very glad to hear about that. So in my classes, obviously, since our students now, as Murray, you said, many of them weren't born when the Soviet bloc existed, you have to start off explaining to them what a communist regime was and what the difference is in so many ways, politically, economically, culturally, artistically, literature, education, all the many differences. But of course, it's one thing to describe these things and to have students listen to me or read books describing the different systems. The best way to educate, as we all know, is to have people who lived through it talk to students about it. And of course, you all at the Victims of Communism Memorial have on your website some videos of people who have survived communist regimes. So one of the things I do in my classes is I bring in, whenever possible, people who have in fact lived through communist regimes. And since I am particularly an expert on the Soviet Union and East Germany, my guests tend to be from Russia or East Germany, and I'll tell you about a few of them. But first, I want to mention really what I think is the most moving book, which I decided a couple years ago to just make mandatory reading in my classes on the Cold War. And it's a memoir written by an incredible woman who went through Stalin's Gulag, Yevgenia Ginsburg. It's a 2-volume memoir. Available in English. The first volume is called Journey into the Whirlwind, and the second is called Within the Whirlwind. It tells of her experience as a dedicated communist at first, being arrested, being interrogated, being imprisoned, ultimately being sent to Kolyma, the worst of the Gulag. But her writing is so exquisitely beautiful, and her spirit is so strong that it is just a fantastic way to introduce students to really the worst of communism. Then some people who I have brought to my classes include several people who escaped from East Germany, because obviously one of the key things in explaining to students about communism is the lack of freedom of travel, the lack of so many freedoms. But again, as Murray said, in this day and age when, kids can fly all over the world and they're Facebook friends with people all over the world and, the world is their oyster, it's hard to imagine that, what it's like not to be able to travel, that you have to. It's one thing when you have to apply for a visa to go visit another country. It's another thing when you have to apply for a visa to leave your own country and go somewhere else. And so many people in East Germany just tried to flee. For one thing, because as soon as you applied for a visa to travel or for an exit visa, meaning you applied to be allowed to leave permanently, you were fired from your job. Most people in your family were fired from their jobs, and you were subjected to all sorts of discrimination. And so a lot of people tried to avoid that process by just escaping, if at all possible. But of course, many people died in the process. Yet many people did do it. So, for example, Thoralf Pilz, who is now a German diplomat, in May 1989, as a young man, he decided he was going to take the train from East Germany to Hungary to go on vacation in Hungary. And he was a very strong swimmer. He trained for months so that he would be ready to swim across a narrow section of the Drava River from Hungary over to the Croatian region of Yugoslavia. He went with a friend. The friend didn't make it, but he did. Mario Ruhlig, in 1987, he was 20 years old, and he decided he had had enough of communist East Germany. He was gay and endured a lot of discrimination because of that, and wanted to get out. So he tried to take the same path as Thoralf Pilz by taking the train to Hungary. He then tried to scope out the border with Yugoslavia, but a farmer saw him, and farmers in Hungary living near the border got paid money if they turned in people trying to escape. So this farmer, quickly called the local police. They came and got him. They called the East German secret police, the Stasi, who came down, picked him up, brought him back to East Berlin, and threw him in the worst Stasi prison, Hohenschönhausen, in East Berlin. He was, the following year, his freedom was bought by West Germany, which did that with political prisoners increasingly paid to get them out of the country. And he then lived in West Berlin. When the wall came down on November 9th, 1989, instead of being overjoyed like you might think he was in fact utterly panicked because he thought, oh my God, I've been protected by the wall over here in West Berlin, but now maybe all these Stasi guys are going to come get me and take me back. So it was an absolute traumatic moment for him, and he still suffers psychologically and can't hold down a job. But he does enjoy his freedom, and in fact, he recently finished a big tour of many of the national parks in the United States and posted on Facebook, how different things are now. Lars Hansel, who grew up in East Germany and is now here with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Washington, he remembers vividly how militarized every single aspect of communist education was. whether it was a math problem, you know, if NATO has 300 tanks and the Warsaw Pact has, you know, 400, these kinds of things. Literature, art, I mean, just everything was militarized that you learned in school, but also your extracurricular activities. And he talked about just being so sick of it that you just couldn't get away from it. A good friend of mine, Ruth, was in the East German opposition, living in East Berlin, and she decided to apply for an exit permit. She was, of course, fired from her job, and a lot of pressure was put on her, and then they did what they always did when they ultimately let you go, was you've got 24 hours. You've got to be out tomorrow by noon. You can take whatever you can fit in your car or fit in your suitcase, but that's it. She left East Berlin a month before the Berlin Wall opened, having no idea that it was going to open, like no one had any idea. She, to this day, lives in the western section of Berlin and will never live in the eastern section again. A friend of mine from the former Soviet Union, the historian Vlad Zubak, he talks about how important Western culture was. Rock music, jazz, blue jeans, behind the Iron Curtain, that these things were all forbidden, which made them all the more desirable. You know, it's sort of counterintuitive maybe with all the propaganda about how the US and NATO were more warmongers and aggressive and all these things, that the culture was so embraced by, particularly by young people, but not just by young people in communist regimes. And he talks about that for him and for so many others in the Soviet Union, that was the most important factor, not, for example, hardline policies by President Reagan, but the attractiveness of Western culture and blue jeans and rock and roll. Many Germans themselves would say that the fall of the wall was due primarily to Gorbachev. Gorbachev is an absolute hero in both the eastern and the western parts of Germany, that it was his policies that contributed the most. Instead of, for example, President Reagan, his words at the Brandenburg Gate 2.5 years before the wall came down, Germans point to Gorbachev. Another thing I want to talk about in educating people about communism is understanding that the communist system was not monolithic. That's obvious in the case of the Soviets versus China, but there are other cases that may be less obvious. The issue of local agency of the Cubans or the East Germans or the Hungarians, their own communist regimes, and sort of the responsibility of those local communist regimes for what went on, and for the atrocities that were perpetrated. After German unification, there were trials of some of the top political and military leaders for the shoot-to-kill order at the Berlin Wall. The last Communist Party leader of East Germany, Egon Krenz, brought up a rather interesting defense in the trial. He essentially told the judge, aside from saying this is Victor's justice, this is totally unfair to put us on trial because it was law, it was all accepted in East Germany. But he said, you've got it all wrong. You can't blame us. Don't you remember what President Ronald Reagan said? He said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall. He didn't say Mr. Honecker, the leader of East Germany. He expected that it was a Soviet responsibility. So Egon Krenz said essentially, don't blame us, it was all Moscow's fault. The last Minister of Defense of East Germany, Heinz Kessler, also argued on trial. Essentially, it was the Cold War. There were two big blocs. We at the front line, we had no control over things. It was the two superpowers. But archival evidence, of which there is a lot to help people understand the history of communist regimes, archival evidence makes it absolutely clear that, for example, in the case of the decision to build the Berlin Wall in 1961, there's no way you can put all the blame on Moscow. In fact, the Soviets resisted the pleas and proddings and unilateral actions at the border of the East German leader, Walter Ulbricht. The Soviets resisted for 8 years. They said, no, you can't close the border in Berlin. Are you kidding? We'll look terrible. All the Germans will hate us. All the Berliners will hate us. Besides, it's not technically possible. It'll alienate the West. No, there's no way. You've got to find some other way to keep your people from fleeing. But after 8 years and increasing numbers of East Germans fleeing, such that by the summer of 1961, over 1,000 East Germans were fleeing every single day to the West, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev finally gave in and allowed the Berlin Wall to be built. So there are huge numbers of archival sources that can be used and should be used. And all of us who teach on this have our students use these sources. There are three major organizations that have a lot of documents translated into English online. Here in Washington, the Cold War International History Project. Fantastic resource. You can search by topic, you can search by crisis, by date, by leader, all sorts of things that take you behind the Iron Curtain and really give you a sense of what was going on. Also here in Washington, the National Security Archive, located at George Washington University, has all sorts of documents as well from the former communist bloc. And finally, the Parallel History Project, also online, looks at documents from the Warsaw Pact and NATO, telling the history of those two organizations. So there are great ways to engage students in understanding these systems by reading the documents for themselves. And one fascinating thing you see again and again in communist documents are the incredible efforts at total control in every part of society. Again, architecture, literature, the press, teaching, everything. You see it. But then you also see their incredible frustration when, of course, they couldn't achieve total control. And so, they've got all these informants, who are saying, well, Comrade X expressed skepticism about whether, the party policy, the party economic policy is really working or not. So, there are always people within a system who are critical and who are expressing that. And so many of them, of course, were punished by the communist regimes. So I'll make a couple concluding remarks and then turn it over to the next speaker. Americans, of course, aren't the only ones who study the history of communist regimes. The Chinese, for example, have devoted intense study to, in their view, what went wrong with the Soviet Union. Why did it collapse? Because they are desperately trying to avoid that scenario. So, of course, what they've done is try to focus on economic reforms and not on political reforms, because they're absolutely convinced that it was Gorbachev's glasnost, particularly openness, as in allowing criticism and freedom of speech, that brought the system down. Koreans on both sides of the DMZ have studied very closely the history of what happened in Germany. We don't know much about how the North Koreans have gone about this, but of course they want to avoid a similar scenario where communist North Korea collapses and is absorbed into capitalist democratic South Korea. South Korea has a Ministry of Unification, and they have invited just about every prominent German politician who had anything to do with German unification to come to South Korea and talk to them about the process of what led to the collapse of East Germany and how the unification process has happened since. They want to know very much what kinds of West German policies may have helped bring about the collapse of East Germany. And then, of course, they want to know things like how much money has it taken to bring the eastern part of Germany up to Western standards. And right now it's been, €1 trillion have been invested in the eastern part of Germany to bring it up to Western standards. And obviously it would be far more in Korea. North Korea, however, having nuclear weapons makes this whole scenario much more complicated than it was in the case of East Germany. Finally, on Germany itself, dealing with the communist past, this, as you can imagine, has been fairly fraught and quite politicized, how you go about dealing with the communist past. It's also been very complicated because unlike in other countries in Eastern and Central Europe that have sort of stayed the same, East Germany disappeared. So it's not East Germans themselves coming to grips with the communist regime. It's United Germany. And United Germany has been dominated by the West Germans. And so the trials initially against border guards and their superiors were, of course, carried out by West German judges, prosecutors, and lawyers. So this has definitely complicated things in Germany. In terms of education in Germany, it really depends very much where you go to school, what kind of textbooks there are, what you learn about it. I've talked to many Germans about this, and many of them say that they feel it's somewhat like the U.S. dealing with Civil War history. War of Northern Aggression versus the Civil War. If you're born in the North or the South, it affects the history you learn about the Civil War here. And there's some similarities in Germany. Finally, the Germans have formed some offices that deal with, that sort of highlight people who have lived through the communist experience and want to talk about it and are available to go speak in schools. So there's a website, teachers can look up, they can see, who is in their area, they can bring that person into the classroom to talk to the students, to give them a sense of what it was like. And finally, coming back to this Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and the efforts that you're doing here to memorialize the victims and what you're going to do tomorrow, the Germans have come, it took them a long time. It took over 20 years. Well, it took over 15 years for the Germans to decide that they should, in fact, give the victims names. who was killed when they tried to escape across the Berlin Wall? You know, who was tortured in prison? These kinds of things. And there is now what's called a window of memory in the former death strip of the Berlin Wall at the Berlin Wall Memorial that has pictures of the 136 people who were killed trying to escape across the Berlin Wall in Berlin. Obviously, the number of victims who tried to escape across the much larger border between East Germany and West Germany is another matter. They have also published a biographical handbook that describes those people, who they were, why they tried to escape, what their families were told or usually not told after their family member was killed trying to escape. And currently, there are a group of researchers paid for by the federal German government currently figuring out those details about the much bigger East German, West German border. Who was killed? What was their background? Why did they try to escape? And what happened to them? So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
It's a privilege and an honor to be here at a place that actually memorializes real victims. We live in a time where everybody claims to be a victim of something, you know, victim of white privilege, a victim of this, a victim of that. Communism killed lots and lots of people. Those are real victims. And I think an organization like this is necessary to ensure that people understand that. Not to diminish anything, you know, none of the Nazi war crimes, but the fact is the communists killed many more people than the Nazis did. And they did it whether they're Chinese or Russian or Korean. And it's an unfortunate thing, I think, that people don't seem to understand that. I think Professor Harrison is absolutely right. There are plenty of courses on the Soviet regime, plenty of courses on the Cold War and so forth, but there's sometimes a tendency to treat the Cold War as sort of the moral equivalence between the United States and the Soviet Union. We don't make that same mistake when we talk about the Nazis. We make it clear that the Nazi regime was an evil one. That was, of course, one of the points that Ronald Reagan did, much to the dismay and horror of the people in this country, when he basically called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Communism, of course, not only killed the body, but it killed the soul. And I always like to point, I'm sure all of you have seen the movie The Lives of Others, in which you see the deadening of that kind of regime, just complete. And what's remarkable about that is this one man who has a flicker in his soul that makes him a human being, unlike the other people in the Stasi for whom he works. Now, I think that, as I suggested, that everybody seems to know about the crimes of the Nazis, fascists, and so forth. But in many cases, although we sometimes acknowledge what's going on or what has gone on in the Soviet Union and other places, we tend to let the Soviets off the hook, the communists off the hook. For instance, for a very long time, Robert Conquest was one of those who studied the Soviet, basically the cost of communism in the Soviet Union. He was a great researcher, and his books were prescient. When the Soviet archives were opened, in fact, it turned out that many of his, or that all of his, most of his assessments, basically his suggestion of the number of people who have been killed, was pretty much right on the money. But again, the same sort of thing with China. But there's, again, too many people who tend to let the communists off the hook. I just recount two anecdotes for you. I taught at the Naval War College from 1987 until 2014, and in the early 90s, I was asked to come address basically a high school course. The teacher was talking about American history and the Cold War and so forth. And it went through the front office of the War College, and they asked me to do it, so I did. I went over and first of all, gained great admiration for high school teachers. This fellow, in basically seven sessions and 7 periods, taught 6 courses. You know, the same thing, AP and the others. Now, I made some comment, I remember, that suggested that in the end of the Cold War, into communism, and that was kind of a good thing. And all of a sudden, I was taken on by this, this very intelligent young woman who basically, well, what's wrong with communism? And I mean, I was almost didn't have an answer. I mean, I thought it was so obvious that that would be the case. But, she was in an AP class here, and I later went on to Brown University. I don't know what happened to her. But the fact is that this sort of, I would call it ignorance, was really kind of astounding to me. The other time I was asked to be on a program, it was a TV program with Gus Hall. Now, I don't know if you don't recognize the name Gus Hall. He was the head of the American Communist Party for years and years and years, and one of the most obsequious bootlickers of the Soviet system that you can imagine. And I had to sit next to him, and after the whole thing, I really wanted to take a shower. I mean, they're really an odious creature. But the fact is that he had this following. He talked at Brown earlier, and there were about 20 or 30 students that followed him up there to be on the program and ask questions. And it occurred to me that, there's something wrong if that is really the case. Now, again, I have some suggestions. One of the things I told Murray I was going to do is talk about the obstacles to educating about the cost of communism. And I think there are 3. The first one basically is that the false promises of communism. I mean, we know that in the abstract, the whole idea of communism is once you abolish private property, the class system will go away, and everyone will live on this heaven on earth. And of course, when and by the way, that's inclusive of everyone. One of the big problems with Nazism was it was self-limiting. It was exclusive. If you were a Jew or a Slav, you could not be a Nazi. Okay, so the difference with communism, of course, is that you can be a communist if you're anybody. And it is this promise that seems to suggest this equal world in the future, if only we can get there, if only we can abolish private property. And of course, that served as an excuse in many cases to say, well, of course, the communists have to be tough because of the intractability of human beings. They seem to be attached to things like the family and property and the like. And of course, we end up with some of the situations that Dr. Harrison talked about. This intractability must be stamped out. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have such a huge human cost associated with communism, but at the same time where people who don't live under communist regimes will basically excuse that kind of actions and behaviors and so forth. The second reason I think is, if you've heard the term cultural Marxism, nobody really lives, even communists themselves don't believe in dialectical materialism anymore. But the fact is you've got this thing, and a wonderful portrayal of this is a recent book by a fellow named Michael Walsh called The Devil's Pleasure Palace. I recommend that you read this, because he talks about the toxins that were released into the American system by immigrants from Germany, the Frankfurt boys, as I call them, people like Herbert Marcuse, Theodor Adorno, Wilhelm Reich, people like this, that basically more or less normalized something that is not necessarily basically the problem was that it wasn't that they didn't criticize communism, it was that they undercut the argument on behalf of a Western liberal tradition. It's undermining the fabric of the West, in other words. And it's interesting because that whole thing, I mean, it started much before the fall of the Soviet Union, but in some respects it was aided and abetted by that. Remember the days back in the early 90s, Frank Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which basically suggested that of the three great isms of the 20th century, World War II had destroyed fascism, and now the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of communism. So there's only Western liberalism was left. Well, it didn't work out to be that way. But this morning I just saw an essay that Harry Jaffa wrote, or a lecture that he gave back in 1991, which gets right to this. He said in the final paragraph, the defeat of communism in the USSR and its satellite empires by no means assures its defeat in the world. Indeed, the release of the West from its conflict with the East emancipate utopian communism at home from the suspicion of its affinity with an external enemy. The struggle for the preservation of Western civilization has entered a new and perhaps far more deadly and dangerous phase. And again, I think there's the whole approach on college campuses today that you see in many places where free speech is not tolerated. And this goes back to Marcuse's idea of repressive tolerance, that if you let all these ideas out there, the bad ideas are going to surface, so you have to repress them. But that's really tolerant. Makes perfect sense to me. But you see the issue. I think there's a lot of this in the academy, and again, there's certainly it's not all like that, but there's enough of it that I think there's a tendency sometimes to let the crimes of the communist systems go unremarked, much less punished. The final reason for this, I think, is the belief on the part of many that criticizing communism, even systems that in the past, is just another form of McCarthyism. Now, basically that's the issue of substance and style and substance. But one of my colleagues at IWP, we were talking about this the other day, and he's doing work on the whole issue of the Soviet penetration of the Roosevelt administration. And he says that a lot of times historians get pushback on that because, oh, you're opening all these wounds, that's McCarthyite, and so forth. But I think, I think that if you combine these three things, you get one of the reasons why organizations like the Victims of Communism is necessary, because they have to overcome these problems. There's a lot of work to do. And of course, some of the ways that Dr. Harrison just mentioned, the idea basically of educating the educators. That takes a lot of time, but it's probably the most useful approach. I happen to teach in a master's program for teachers at Ashland University in Ohio. Now, the courses I teach are basically on American politics, Civil War Reconstruction, and so forth. But teachers come in who, all they know about history is that they're basically one day ahead of their students in the textbook. And our whole idea basically, of course, is to educate them in terms of original documents and the like. So any of those sorts of things that are being done, I think, are useful. But we also have to, once again, make the moral argument that just like Hitler's regime, these communist regimes were also, in the sense, not morally equivalent to the United States. I know in foreign policy you have realism, which basically suggests that regimes don't really matter, but in fact they really do. Let me mention one more thing. The founder and the president of IWP is John Lanchowski. And I don't know if you heard this, but a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, I guess, we hosted the new Polish president at IWP, and we had a nice discussion about things we could do. And one of the things that John talks about is the idea of basically, he suggested to the president, basically a Nuremberg style trial. Now, what? Wait a minute, how do you do that? The idea, of course, would be a show trial, but it's also designed to educate people about the moral failings of of communist regimes. And definitely, real quick finish here. Dr. Cole showed that photograph of Che Guevara. And I have to tell you, there's nothing that annoys me more than seeing somebody with a Che Guevara shirt on. So just about 3 or 4 years ago, I was in one of my favorite watering holes in Newport, and minding my own business. But this fella came in, and if it's an idiot kid, that's one thing. But this was an older guy, and there he was with this stupid Che shirt on. So I tried to bite my tongue. And finally, I had what I call a Popeye moment. So all I can stand because I can't stand no more. So I walked over and I said, "Hey man, what's with the shirt? You know that guy was a mass murderer." I said, "Were they out of Hitler shirts? Were they out of Pop Art shirts?" All these sort of things. And anyway, he obviously felt uncomfortable at that. I put trigger warning or something like that, and he left. But I just thought that I would share that with you, in doing my part to try to educate some idiots on the whole issue of the problem. Thank you very much.